January 22nd, 2026, 4:47 in the morning. Tancítaro, Michoacán, Mexico. The town of Tancítaro sits in the volcanic highlands of western Michoacán, 11,000 feet above sea level, surrounded on every side by avocado orchards stretching as far as any map has ever managed to record. In the winter months, before the sun clears the eastern ridgeline, the temperature drops below 40 degrees and the air smells of wood smoke and wet soil. The packing houses that line the state highway are dark at this hour, most of them, not all. At 4:47 a.m. on January 22nd, 2026, 4 olive drab Secretaría de Marina tactical vehicles, CIMAR, Mexico's naval infantry, rolled without headlights onto the access road connecting the state highway to Empacadora La Sierra, an avocado packing and cold storage depot that had been shipping certified Hass avocados to American grocery chains, including H-E-B stores throughout Texas, since October 2018. The vehicles stopped 200 meters short of the main gate. No radio traffic, no overhead light. The 31 Marines aboard them had rehearsed this approach 17 times in a warehouse outside Guadalajara. They knew the position of every camera. They knew which guard rotations ran short. They knew, down to the square meter, what was inside. What they found would constitute the largest reverse trafficking firearms seizure in the documented history of joint United States-Mexico law enforcement cooperation. 2,400 rifles, staged, crated, and ready for distribution to Sinaloa cartel logistics cells across 3 Mexican states. Every single weapon had originated in the United States of America. This is the story of how those guns got there, how 11 months of secret binational intelligence work dismantled the pipeline that moved them, and what it cost the men and women who made that operation possible. The investigation that would become Operation Sierra Verde began not in Mexico but in El Paso, Texas. On a Tuesday morning in February 2025, Special Agent David Kowalczyk of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF El Paso Field Division, was reviewing an e-trace submission that had come in from the Procuraduría General de la República, the Mexican Federal Attorney General's office. The e-trace program is the mechanism through which Mexican law enforcement submits firearms recovered at crime scenes or in seizures to the ATF for origin tracing. The system is routine, voluminous, and often slow. On most mornings, the queue contains dozens of entries. This particular morning, it contained one entry that Kowalczyk had never seen before. The firearm in question was a Romanian WASR-10, a semi-automatic rifle chambered in 7.62 by 39 mm, recovered at a cartel checkpoint near Apatzingan in January 2025 after a confrontation between Sinaloa-affiliated gunmen and a Jalisco New Generation splinter cell. The rifle itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the trace result. The WASR-10 had been purchased at a licensed federal firearms dealer in Clint, Texas, a small town 15 miles east of El Paso, on September 14, 2024. It had been purchased by a man named Felipe Garza Cruz, a United States citizen with a Texas driver's license. It had been recovered in Mexico 4 months later. Kowalczyk ran Garza Cruz's name through the ATF's multiple sales monitoring system and found that Garza Cruz had purchased 6 semi-automatic rifles at 3 separate Texas dealers between June and November 2024. 6 rifles from one buyer in 5 months, all purchased at small-town dealers along the Texas-Mexico border corridor. Under federal law, dealers are required to report multiple rifle sales to the ATF when a buyer purchases 2 or more semi-automatic rifles over .22 caliber within 5 consecutive business days. The reports had been filed, they had been processed. What the system had not done, until this particular trace came back, was connect the individual purchases to a single pattern. David Kowalczyk called his supervisor, Senior Special Agent Patricia Ruiz, and told her he thought he had something. Ruiz told him to write it up. He spent 3 days writing it up. At the end of those 3 days, he had the beginning of what would become an 11-month joint intelligence operation between the ATF El Paso Field Division, the DEA El Paso Intelligence Center, and Mexico's Secretaría de Marina Armada de México, ISEMA. The pipeline Kowalczyk had stumbled onto was not new. It was, in fact, a mature and sophisticated operation that had been running in some form for approximately 4 years. Its mechanics were simple enough to understand and complex enough to have evaded detection for that length of time. The fundamental premise was this: American gun laws, particularly in Texas, permitted the purchase of semi-automatic rifles in ways that Mexican law absolutely prohibited. A Mexican cartel that needed firearms could not easily obtain them on the American market directly. It lacked American citizens as buyers, American addresses, and American identification. What it could do was recruit American citizens living in the border zone, pay them a flat fee per weapon, and direct them to purchase legally available firearms at licensed dealers across a broad geographic range, using genuine American documentation in quantities and at intervals specifically designed to stay just below the reporting thresholds that might generate unwanted scrutiny. These individuals were known as straw purchasers. Their use was a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 922 Ad 6, and the ATF had pursued straw purchaser cases along the southern border for decades. What made this particular network different from the hundreds of individual straw purchase prosecutions that had accumulated over the years was its scale, its organization, and its single point of consolidation. The pipeline did not scatter weapons across a dozen independent delivery routes. It funneled everything through one location, a series of trailer staging yards on the southern outskirts of Laredo, Texas, operated by a freight logistics company called Transportes Meridiano LLC, which had been registered with the Texas Secretary of State in March 2021. Transportes Meridiano was nominally a legitimate cross-border freight broker, and some of its business was entirely legitimate. Mexican produce, auto parts, industrial equipment. The company had real clients, real contracts, and real drivers. What it also had, buried in the operational rhythm of its legitimate business, was a secondary load planning function that existed for one purpose: moving firearms south across the international bridges. The rifles were broken down into components or left assembled depending on the model. They were wrapped in oilcloth, packed into PVC tubes sealed with plumber's cement, and nested inside shipments of legitimate goods, avocados, limes, industrial fasteners, that moved back across the border in the same trailers that had brought produce north. Customs and Border Protection inspectors on the southbound lane at the Laredo International Bridges screened vehicles for narcotics and currency moving north. Southbound inspections existed but were far less intensive. The cartel's logistics coordinators knew the inspection protocols in close detail. Over approximately 40 months, Transportes Meridiano and a rotating cast of 6 associated staging operations had moved an estimated 3,200 firearms into Mexico through the Laredo corridor, according to the indictment that would eventually be unsealed in the Western District of Texas. The majority of those weapons were semi-automatic rifles, WASR-10 variants, Alaska pattern semi-automatics of Romanian and Czech manufacture, polymer lower AR pattern rifles, and large quantities of what the firearms industry calls 80% receivers, unfinished aluminium or polymer blocks that are not legally classified as firearms under federal law, and therefore require no background check to purchase, but that can be completed into functional firearms with basic tools and about 4 hours of work. The ghost gun kits, as they came to be called in law enforcement briefings, had been purchased from a dozen online retailers and shipped to addresses in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, before being consolidated at a storage unit in Del Rio and moved south. The destination for the consolidated weapons shipments was Empacadora La Sierra. The depot had been established in Tancítaro in 2018 with a USDA-approved import certification and the legitimizing paperwork of a functioning agricultural business. Its owner of record was a Michoacán-based agricultural corporation with clean tax filings and a board of directors consisting of 4 men whose names and biographical information were entirely fabricated. Established, a SEMAR intelligence brief would later confirm, via Sinaloa cartel financial cell operating out of Culiacán. The depot processed real avocados. It employed real workers. Its cold storage facilities were genuine and its export documentation was valid. The avocados that arrived at HEB distribution centers in San Antonio and Houston had been grown, picked, and packed by actual workers who had no knowledge of what else moved through the building. What those workers did not know, and what the depot's day shift managers had been specifically compartmentalized from knowing, was that the building's largest cold storage bay, a sealed, climate-controlled chamber on the structure's north end, accessible only through a separate exterior door secured with a commercial-grade keypad lock, was not used for perishable produce at all. It was used as a long-term staging facility for firearms awaiting distribution to Sinaloa operational cells. The rifles entered the depot through the same loading dock that received produce from Mexico City distribution points, arriving in refrigerated semi-trailers driven by contracted drivers who worked for Transportes Meridiano's Mexican affiliate. They were unloaded at night, infantied by a single logistics coordinator who worked only in the sealed bay, and stored in wooden crates originally built to transport avocado processing equipment. The crates were stenciled with agricultural lot numbers. They sat on pallets. They looked, to anyone who opened the exterior door and glanced inside, like surplus warehouse equipment. By January 2026, the sealed cold storage bay at Empacadora La Sierra contained 2,400 rifles in various configurations, along with 41,000 rounds of 7.62 by 39 mm ammunition, 12,000 rounds of 5.56 by 45 mm, approximately 6,000 polymer lower receivers in various stages of completion, and a hand-drawn logistics manifest indicating delivery routes to cartel cells in Sinaloa, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Baja California. The rifles were not uniformly new. Some were 2 years old, having sat in the staging facility while cartel distribution logistics had been interrupted by internal violence. Some were fresh from the most recent shipment, which had crossed the Laredo Bridge on January 8th. The ATF did not know about the Tancitaro depot when David Kowalczyk submitted his initial intelligence memo in February 2025. What it knew was that Felipe Garza Cruz was one node in what appeared to be a larger coordinated straw purchase network. Learning the rest took the better part of a year. The investigation expanded in phases. In March 2025, Patricia Ruiz brought in the DEA El Paso Intelligence Center, specifically its Weapons Trafficking Analysis Cell, which maintained a database of cartel-side procurement contacts that complemented ATF's domestic seller-side e-trace data. The two agencies had worked jointly before. The relationship was established enough that the initial intelligence sharing was accomplished without formal interagency memos or the bureaucratic friction that slows most multi-agency investigations. 3 analysts, 2 from DEA, 1 from ATF, sat down in a secured conference room at the DEA El Paso Intelligence Center on March 11, 2025, and began building a unified picture. What emerged over the following 6 weeks was the outlines of a network. Garza Cruz was not acting alone. There were at least 11 other straw purchasers making purchases at dealers scattered across a broad arc from El Paso East to Del Rio. The buyers were demographically varied, men and women, ages ranging from 23 to 58, employed in agriculture, transportation, retail, and construction. What they shared was a common point of contact: a man named Rodrigo Peña Vargas, 44 years old, a United States citizen born in Juarez, living in a ranch property outside Tornillo, Texas. Peña Vargas ran what appeared, on its surface, to be an agricultural equipment brokerage. His bank records showed regular transactions consistent with small business operations. He filed taxes. He drove a 4-year-old pickup. His LinkedIn profile listed his occupation as regional sales consultant. The ATF opened a Title III wiretap application on Peña Vargas's phone on April 4, 2025. Following the authorization of a federal judge in the Western District of Texas. The application had been supported by a 46-page affidavit submitted by Kowalczyk, who had spent 3 weeks preparing it. The judge signed the order on April 4th. Monitoring began on April 7th. The recordings that came back from Peña Vargas's phone over the next 60 days were, in the language of the eventual indictment, extremely significant. Peña Vargas communicated in a mixture of English, Spanish, and a border-specific code that the ATF's wiretap monitoring team quickly decoded. Rifles were referred to as plants, their calibers were given as crop yields, and delivery dates were discussed as harvest schedules. The agricultural metaphor was thorough and internally consistent. It would not have fooled a professional analyst for more than a few minutes. but it reflected a level of operational sophistication that told the investigators they were not dealing with an improvised criminal enterprise. From the Peña Vargas intercepts, the investigators identified 3 additional brokers operating in the Del Rio, Laredo, and Eagle Pass corridors. Each broker maintained his or her own network of straw purchases and delivery contacts. The brokers communicated with each other only rarely and never discussed the final destination of the weapons. Below Peña Vargas in the organizational structure, the straw purchasers had no knowledge of anything beyond the specific dealer and the specific firearm model they had been instructed to purchase. Above Peña Vargas, the investigators gradually traced communications to a logistics coordinator, a man who appeared in the intercepts under the name Señor Aguacate, Mr. Avocado, who operated from a location south of the border and directed the consolidation of weapons shipments at the Laredo staging yards. The identity of Señor Aguacate took 4 months to establish. The DEA's binational intelligence sharing arrangement with the SEMAR, formalized through a Defense Security Service cleared channel that restricted full operational knowledge to 9 law enforcement officers across both agencies, was the mechanism that ultimately cracked it. In August 2025, a SEMA intelligence cell operating in Culiacan corroborated signals intelligence that identified the logistics coordinator as Arturo Barajas Limon, 39 years old, a Sinaloa cartel mid-tier logistics manager whose primary documented function had been coordinating the cross-border movement of bulk cash from American methamphetamine distribution. The pivot to weapons logistics was apparently a promotion. By September 2025, the Joint Task Force had enough to draw a complete organizational chart. Barajas Limon directed the pipeline. Peña Vargas and 3 fellow brokers managed the straw purchase networks on the American side. Transportes Meridiano LLC managed the cross-border logistics, and at the receiving end, Empacadora La Sierra in Tancítaro, whose connection to the network SEMA's Michoacán Intelligence Unit had established through a combination of informant reporting and signals analysis, served as the weapons consolidation and distribution point. The task force now faced the question that every complex joint operation eventually reaches: when to move. The American side of the case was ready by late September 2025. Kowalczyk and Ruiz had sufficient evidence to indict Peña Vargas and the 3 other brokers, to prosecute Transportes Meridiano, and to seize the Laredo staging yards. They could, in theory, have made their arrests and obtained their convictions. What they would not have done, by moving in September 2025, was reach the warehouse in Tancítaro. The weapons already there would have remained in Sinaloa cartel hands. The pipeline would have been disrupted at the broker level and would almost certainly have reconstituted itself within 6 to 12 months under different management and different company names. The SEMA intelligence cell in Michoacán pressed for more time. Their reasoning was straightforward. If the American arrests were delayed until the Tancítaro depot had reached maximum capacity, until the full current inventory of rifles was staged and awaiting distribution, then a single simultaneous raid would remove the entire accumulated stockpile from circulation. The ATF and DEA concurred. The operation was scheduled for January 2026, timed to coincide with what the signals intelligence suggested would be a major Sinaloa distribution cycle, a period when weapons would be moving out of the Tancítaro depot to cartel cells in multiple states, and when the Americans responsible for the northbound logistics were likely to be present at the Laredo staging yards. During the delay period, the task force continued monitoring. New straw purchase transactions were documented and logged as evidence rather than interdicted. The investigators watched weapons they could have seized continue moving south, a calculated decision that Kowalczyk and Ruiz would later describe in court filings as one of the most difficult of their professional careers. On January 14, 2026, 8 days before the planned strike, the Joint Task Force convened a final operational briefing at a Defense Department facility outside San Antonio. Present were 12 individuals, Kowalczyk, Ruiz, two DEA El Paso Intelligence Center analysts, a Department of Justice liaison from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas, a DSS-cleared communications officer who had managed the binational intelligence channel, and, via secure video link, a SEMA captain and two intelligence officers from the Michoacan Tactical Unit. The briefing lasted 6 hours. It covered target locations, tactical entry sequences, arrest priorities, evidence preservation protocols, and contingency planning for armed resistance, which the intelligence product had assessed as likely, given the presence of cartel security personnel at the Tanchitaro depot. On the American side, the plan called for simultaneous execution of 5 search warrants at the Tornillo Ranch property of Rodrigo Peña Vargas, at 3 Laredo area staging yards operated by Transportes Meridiano, and at a commercial storage facility in Del Rio that the brokers had used for intermediate weapon staging. Federal arrest warrants had been issued for 14 individuals on the American side, including Peña Vargas, 3 fellow brokers, 4 Transportes Meridiano employees, and the owner of the Del Rio storage facility. On the Mexican side, the SEMAR was responsible for the Tanchitaro depot. The Mexican operation was entirely outside American jurisdiction. The ATF and DEA had no presence on the ground in Michoacan. The coordination was deconfliction only, ensuring that tactical actions on both sides of the border occurred within minutes of each other, so that communications between the depot and American side contacts could not compromise either operation. January 22, 2026. 4:47 in the morning, Tanchitaro. The 31 SEMAR Marines deployed from the 4 tactical vehicles in 2 elements. The first element, 18 Marines led by a captain who had led 6 prior counter-cartel entries in Michoacan, moved directly toward the depot's main vehicle gate. The second element, 13 Marines, circled on foot through the Avocado orchard to the north, approaching the sealed cold storage bay from its exterior door, the entry that the logistics coordinator used and that the regular depot workers had never seen opened. The depot's cartel security detail consisted of 6 gunmen. The intelligence product had identified 4 of them by name. 2 were unknown. All 6 were armed with AK pattern rifles that in all probability had passed through this same building on their way south months or years earlier. The firefight began when the security details positioned nearest the vehicle gate opened fire on the first SEMAR element at a range of approximately 40 meters. The exchange lasted approximately 4 minutes. When it ended, 4 of the 6 security personnel had been captured, 2 of them wounded, 1 with a through-and-through gunshot wound to the right thigh, 1 with a wound to the shoulder. 2 security personnel had fled into the Avocado orchard and had not yet been located. 1 SEMAR Marine, a 26-year-old from Mazatlan whose name has not been made public at the time of this account, had been shot in the left arm and evacuated by vehicle to a military clinic in Apatzingan. The second SEMAR element reached the exterior door of the cold storage bay during the firefight. The keypad lock was defeated with a mechanical breaching tool in under 40 seconds. The Marines entered a space approximately 60 feet by 80 feet, lit by overhead fluorescent lights that had been left running on a timer. The crates were stacked in rows on pallets, exactly as the intelligence product had described. Arturo Barajas Limon was not in Tanchitaro on January 22nd. He had departed the area on January 19th, 3 days before the raid, traveling toward Culiacan. The SEMAR's intelligence unit was tracking his movement. His arrest, in coordination with Sinaloa state authorities and a separate SEMAR element operating in the north, occurred at a private residence in Culiacan at approximately 6:30 a.m. on January 22nd, less than 2 hours after the Tanchitaro raid. He was taken without incident. At the Tornillo Ranch in Texas, ATF and Homeland Security investigations agents arrived at the property of Rodrigo Peña Vargas at 4:45 a.m., executing the federal arrest warrant and search warrant simultaneously. Peña Vargas was found in his bedroom. He dressed, was handcuffed, and was placed in the back of a federal vehicle without speaking to the agents. A search of the property produced a 9mm Glock pistol, approximately $11,000 in currency, and a spiral notebook whose contents, written in the same agricultural code used in the intercepted telephone communications, would spend the next 3 days being decoded by an ATF analyst in El Paso. The 3 Laredo staging yards were executed in sequence, beginning at 5 a.m. 8 ATF agents, supported by HSI and Laredo Police Department tactical officers, hit the first yard, operated by Transportes Meridiano, on an industrial road outside the city's port of entry area. 2 employees were present and detained. A search of the facility produced 12 semi-automatic rifles in PVC tubes packed inside a wooden crate marked as machinery parts, along with financial records and vehicle tracking data for 17 trailers that had crossed the international bridge in the preceding 60 days. The second staging yard produced 4 individuals and additional documentary evidence. The third, a smaller facility used for vehicle maintenance, produced 1 individual and 3 unregistered handguns. The Del Rio storage facility was entered at 5:20 a.m. The owner, a 51-year-old man who had no prior criminal record, was taken from a mobile home adjacent to the storage units. The units themselves contained approximately 300 additional ghost gun components, 340 rounds of ammunition, and $11,000 in cash. The owner would later cooperate with federal prosecutors and provide testimony about the logistics arrangements that connected the Del Rio facility to the Laredo staging yards. By 9 a.m. on January 22nd, the operational picture on both sides of the border was clear. In Mexico, 19 individuals in custody, including Arturo Barajas Limon and 17 workers at the Tancítaro depot, who were detained pending determination of their knowledge of the facility's secondary use. The weapons cache in the cold storage bay was being inventoried by SEMAR evidence teams. The count, confirmed over the following 48 hours, stood at 2,412 rifles, broken down as follows: 840 WASR-10 and WASR-10/63 Romanian-manufactured AK pattern semi-automatic rifles, 419 Czech VZ, 58 variant semi-automatic rifles, 691 polymer lower AR pattern rifles of various American manufacturers, 362 80% lower receivers in various stages of completion, 41,300 rounds of 7.62 by 39 mm rifle ammunition, 12,280 rounds of 5.56 by 45 mm, and a logistics manifest listing delivery routes, contact names, and distribution timelines for cartel cells in 5 Mexican states. In the United States, 14 individuals in custody, including Penny Vargas, 3 additional brokers, and 10 individuals associated with Transportes Meridiano and the staging yards. 4 arrest warrants remained outstanding, including 2 straw purchasers who had not been located at their registered addresses. A 5th American-side subject, the owner of a gun parts distribution business in New Mexico, who had supplied a significant portion of the ghost gun components, was taken into custody by ATF Albuquerque Field Division agents at his business address at 9:14 a.m. The unsealing of the federal indictment by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas occurred on the afternoon of January 22, 2026. The charging document named 14 American defendants. The lead charges were conspiracy to illegally transfer firearms to citizens of a foreign country in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 922E, conspiracy to violate the Arms Export Control Act, conspiracy to engage in the business of dealing in firearms without a federal firearms license, and money laundering. Rodrigo Peña Vargas faced an additional charge of bulk cash smuggling related to cartel payments received via encrypted cryptocurrency transfers. Maximum combined sentences for the lead charges reached the equivalent of multiple decades in federal custody. On the Mexican side, the FGR, the Fiscalía General de la República, unsealed a parallel indictment naming 19 individuals under Mexican federal law, including Barajas Limon, whose charges encompassed organized crime, illegal weapons possession, and organized crime conspiracy statutes. The Joint Department of Justice and FGR press statement, released simultaneously in Washington and Mexico City at 4 p.m. on January 22nd, described the operation as the largest reverse trafficking takedown in the documented history of the ATF's Project Gunrunner successor enforcement programs and the largest joint ATF-SEMAR operational action since at least 2012, the press statement did not by design mention any of the 9 individuals who had full operational knowledge of the case before it became public. It did not mention David Kowalczyk, who had spent 11 months on a single investigation that consumed roughly a third of his available working hours for an entire year. It did not mention Patricia Rose, who had managed the interagency relationships with a level of diplomatic precision that kept a multinational investigation from fracturing along the institutional fault lines that destroy most complex joint cases. It did not mention the SEMAR captain whose element entered the cold storage bay while gunfire was still audible 50 feet away. It did not mention the 26-year-old Marine from Mazatlan who had been shot and was, by 9 a.m. on January 22nd, in stable condition at a military clinic with a wound to his left arm and a discharge timeline measured in weeks rather than days. To understand why this case matters, why it is worth reconstructing in detail now that the indictment has been unsealed and the court record has become partially public, it is necessary to understand the scale of the problem it represents only one solved instance of. The ATF's annual firearms trafficking reports, compiled from e-trace data submitted by Mexican federal and state law enforcement, have consistently documented that the majority of firearms recovered at crime scenes in Mexico, in some reporting years as high as 70%, trace back to purchase points in the United States. The numbers in those reports are not small. In 2023, the most recent full reporting year available at the time of this account, Mexican authorities submitted more than 42,000 e-trace requests to the ATF. More than 27,000 of those requests returned confirmed American purchase points. These are not weapons that were stolen from military arsenals or manufactured in clandestine machine shops, although both of those things also happen. They are largely weapons that were legally sold by licensed American dealers to buyers who presented valid American identification, completed federally required background checks, and signed federal forms attesting that they were the actual purchasers of the firearms and that they were not purchasing on behalf of another person. The background checks found nothing problematic, the forms were signed, the sales were completed, the weapons were then diverted. The straw purchase network that Kowalczyk identified in February 2025 and that Operation Sierra Verde dismantled in January 2026 was one of dozens of such networks operating simultaneously along the 2,000-mile border. The rifles in the cold storage bay at Empacada de la Sierra, 2,412 of them, represent a fraction of the weapons that have moved south over the preceding 4 years through the combination of organized straw purchase schemes, ghost gun component trafficking, and the exploitation of American commercial firearms infrastructure by foreign criminal organizations, with essentially unlimited procurement budgets. The weapons that did not go to Tancitaro, the ones that moved through different pipelines to different staging points, the ones that were delivered before the operation began, the ones that are already in the hands of cartel gunmen in Sinaloa and Sonora and Baja California, will not be seized by any raid. They are gone. What the raid removed was what was there on January 22nd, 2026, in a locked cold storage bay on the northern end of an Avocado depot that shipped certified produce to American grocery chains. Rodrigo Peña Vargas's arraignment in El Paso Federal Court took place on January 27, 2026, 5 days after his arrest. He appeared in a dark jacket, said nothing beyond the required yes sir and no sir responses to the magistrate's questions, and was remanded without bail. His attorney indicated that plea negotiations were not yet underway. The other American defendants were arraigned in the same week. One, a straw purchaser in his mid-20s with no prior record, retained a public defender and was reportedly discussing cooperation. The others retained private counsel. In Culiacan, Arturo Barajas Limon appeared before a federal magistrate on January 24th. The FGR filed for preventive detention pending trial. It was granted. His attorney, a Sinaloa-based defense lawyer with extensive experience in federal organized crime cases, issued a statement to a regional newspaper saying that his client denied all charges and that the evidence had been obtained through improper means, a claim that the FGR's spokesperson declined to address, citing the ongoing nature of the proceedings. The SEMAR Marine from Mazatlan was discharged from the military clinic in Apatzingan on February 4th, 13 days after being wounded. According to a brief note in a SEMAR operational summary released in early February, he declined a formal commendation ceremony. The summary noted that his arm would require additional rehabilitation before he could return to active duty. The summary did not give his name. David Kowalczyk took 1 day off following the conclusion of the operational phase. On January 24, 2026, he was back at his desk in El Paso, reviewing a new batch of e-trace submissions from the FGR. There were 43 of them. He began working through the list. The cold storage bay at Avocado de la Sierra was emptied by SEMAR evidence teams over 2 days. The weapons were transported to a secure federal facility in Mexico City for processing and destruction. The wooden crates, the pallets, the stenciled agricultural lot numbers, all of it was catalogued, photographed, and retained as evidence. The legitimate Avocado operations at the depot were suspended pending the outcome of asset forfeiture proceedings against the corporate entity that owned the property. The workers, the ones who had packed and shipped and cold stored real avocados without knowing what the locked bay on the north end of the building contained, were released without charges after individual interviews confirmed their lack of knowledge. Most of them had families in Tancitaro. The local economy ran on avocados. The avocados that had already been shipped to American grocery stores before January 22nd had already been eaten. What this case illuminates in its operational arc, from a single e-trace submission in a federal queue to a firefight in a Michoacan avocado depot, is the way that sustained, focused, precisely managed intelligence work can occasionally overtake a criminal enterprise that has grown comfortable in its own invisibility. The pipeline had run for years. It had moved thousands of weapons. It had persisted because it was built on the exploitation of entirely legal commercial infrastructure, licensed dealers, legitimate businesses, real agricultural certifications, actual trucking routes, in ways that made its illegal component nearly invisible against the background noise of normal commerce. It took one agent noticing one anomalous e-trace result on a Tuesday morning in El Paso. It took 11 months of work by 9 people who could not tell anyone else what they were doing. It took a Marine from Mazatlan willing to enter a locked building while people were shooting at him. And it took the willingness of 2 countries' law enforcement agencies to trust each other with information that, if mishandled, would have destroyed the operation entirely and endangered the people running it. The 2 security personnel who fled into the avocado orchard during the initial firefight were taken into custody by SEMAR elements within 3 hours of the raid. They were found hiding in an irrigation channel approximately 400 meters from the depot, cold and unarmed, having abandoned their weapons in the orchard. They were added to the list of 19 detained and ultimately indicted. Both were in their early 20s. Both had been hired for security work at the depot 6 months earlier, recruited through contacts in the Sinaloa cartel's Michoacan affiliate. Neither had any documented prior contact with the federal justice system. Both are awaiting trial. The logistics manifest recovered from the cold storage bay, the hand-drawn document listing distribution routes and contact names for cartel cells in 5 Mexican states, is, at the time of this account's preparation, being used by the FGR and the DEA to develop intelligence on the recipient cells that were expecting the weapons. Those cells have been put on notice, in the most direct way possible, that the shipment is not coming. What they do next, whether they attempt to reconstitute their supply through a different broker network, whether they absorb the loss and operate with what they have, whether any individual within those cells will make a mistake that generates a new e-trace submission for a new agent to review on some future morning, is not yet known. What is known is this: on January 22nd, 2026, 2,412 rifles sat in a locked cold storage room in Tancitaro, Michoacan, crated and staged and ready. By nightfall, they were in federal custody, surrounded by SEMAR evidence teams, catalogued by lot number and on their way to destruction. They will not fire, they will not wound or kill. The children and journalists and farmers and police officers who might have been on the receiving end of those 2,412 weapons will never know how close their worlds came to being changed. That is the nature of prevention. The work that makes it possible happens in places most people will never see, carried out by people most people will never know, on timelines that span months and cross borders, and rest on the institutional patience of law enforcement agencies that sometimes, not always, but sometimes work exactly as they are designed to work. The avocado season in Tancita runs through late spring. By February, the orchards around the depot were already producing again. The workers who had no knowledge of what sat in the sealed bay showed up at other packing houses in the region and resumed work. The depot itself sat under seal, its cold storage system still running on timer, the locked bay empty now, the fluorescent lights cycling on and off in an empty room. David Kowalczyk did not visit Tancitaro. He has never been to Michoacan. He reviewed the photographic evidence the SEMAR forwarded through the DSS-cleared channel, studied the inventory count, and added the case file to the Western District record. He went home that evening, as he did every evening, to a house in El Paso where his wife and 2 children were already asleep. He did not wake them. He made himself a sandwich, sat at the kitchen table for a while, and went to bed. The operation had been given the code name Sierra Verde, Green Mountain. It was a good name for a case about avocados. Someone had a sense of humor. The formal DOJ commendation for the agents involved in Operation Sierra Verde was issued in March 2026. It listed the names of the participating agencies. It did not list the names of individual agents. That is standard practice for active prosecutorial matters. It is also, for the people involved, entirely fine. The commendation was not why any of them did the work. The 2,412 rifles in federal custody were why they did the work. That number is why this story gets told.